Good evening, everybody. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here in Seville. I'd like to thank Professor Matto and everybody who kindly invited me here. And this is the first lecture of the series, and I'd like to just spend some time with you, about 30 minutes or so, just mapping out the kind of ground to do with health and aging. I'm going to touch on some of the issues that have been raised by the speakers, touch on life expectancy, touch on quality of life, touch on activity, what it is to be aged. And to start off with, you may know that I come from Edinburgh. I've flown all the way there today. Well, in fact, I came by the Ave as well. And if you were to come to Edinburgh, and I'd very much like to invite you there, it's a wonderful city, and you were to go into the National Museum, or National Art Gallery in Edinburgh, you would find a very little bit of Seville. In fact, it's a great bit of Seville, really. It's a fantastic masterpiece by Velazquez, and it's titled Old Woman Frying Eggs. And I'll invite you just to have a look at it for a moment while my translator catches up a tad. And it's painted absolutely lovingly. This is from his Seville, early period in Seville. And have a look at the lady. She's the old woman, and there's the young boy. And it tells us so much about aging, how Velazquez has managed to observe so much about aging in this picture. Have a look at her hands, for example. Have a look at the skin on her hands and compare them to the boy's. Can you see how the skin is changed, how it's more wrinkled, the way skin ages? If you look, you get more kind of pigmentation on the skin, you get more wrinkling, the skin holds a little bit looser. And one of the reasons it holds a bit looser is because we lose muscle mass. Have a look at the lady's face. Compare it to the boy's. Have a look at her cheekbones. Have a look at the way the muscles, the jaw muscles are wasting away there. These are changes that you see with aging. Velazquez has perfectly observed these changes. Look at the way the lady's hairline just stretches back, how women become more like men when they become postmenopausal. But that physical aging, that physiological aging, isn't the only thing that's going on here. See what she's up to. She's frying eggs. Now, a very everyday activity, you'd say, but it's a functional activity. It's part of what we do. And one aspect of aging is what our function is, what our activities are. But those activities occur within a context. And here, Velazquez has caught that context. Look, this lady, look at her social role. She's quite old. Maybe nowadays, I don't know how old she is, maybe she was only 50 in those days, but these days I'm sure she'll be of an age biologically where she'll be receiving her pension, and yet she's still there working. She still has a positive, important role in society. Maybe she has to have that role because of her financial and economic status. So aging here in this picture is summed up. It's not just one thing, it's a whole range of dimensions. And there are lots of different dimensions of health. And those dimensions are all affected by aging. So it's a biological aging, the physical changes that we've seen there, but not just physical changes, very important psychological changes occur as we age. We've heard a little bit about some of them to do with cognitive aging. I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment. There's functional aging, the kind of things we can't do so well. Can we manage to get on a bus so well? Can we get up and down stairs so well? Can we bend down and tie up our shoelaces so well? All these things that we take for granted perhaps when we're young, and as we grow older, we all start to find difficulties. Not disease necessarily, it's just the way our bodies change. And of course, there is social aging, something which we are coming to terms with as a society. What is the social role of older people? What's their economic status? And finally, it's not just about what social role or economic status, there's also the person's own perspective. And one of those things that catches that is what we think of as quality of life. So, there's lots to consider when we think about aging and how it impacts on our health. There have been a number of theories of what is called successful aging. And I think we've heard some allusion to some of those by the Vice-Chancellor in policies that have been formulated. They come on the back of some of these theories, these theoretical work. For example, in 1961, as far back as then, Havinghurst had this idea of adding life to years rather than, say, adding years to life. The idea of getting satisfaction from life. About 10 years later, that moved on to what's known as activity theory. You've heard a bit about that today. Maybe it's tied into a more behaviourist view of the world, not so much as to our kind of own subjective view as what's going on, but actually a more objective measure of what people are doing. Forget about what's going on internally, but observe what's happening in real life. The ball wasn't all in that park, if you know what I mean. It was kind of, there was the opposition, the people who thought about aging in terms of the personhood, what it is to be a person, the idea of continuity, that an older person is somehow linked to their younger selves. That healthy aging, successful aging, was maintaining that continuity of self, of personhood. And these developed into the ideas of positive or ideal functioning related to developmental work over the life course, putting things in terms of a whole life course perspective. And perhaps as we move to more social support ideas, putting things in terms of coping strategies, how people can successfully age. Things go wrong, but it's who copes with those things when they go wrong the best that determines successful aging, if you like. So, lots of theories, lots of ways one can think about aging, and there isn't necessarily a right or wrong way, but they are all useful tools, if you like, to help us in the map of what will come over the next few weeks. I have a particular interest in life course perspective, and today I know there's another talk in this series called Disease and Aging, so I thought I'd talk about health and aging, and I've put two things up here. One is to do with health as an idea of continuity and disease as discontinuity. The idea of continuity is very important, and it goes back in English tradition, if you like, in a sense to William Wordsworth, expresses it very well. The idea of the sublime comes out here in his poem. I'll read it because it's such a wonderful poem. He says, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." It's a wonderful expression, I think, of what it is that sustains us, the idea that we are something throughout our lives, continues. On the other hand, here's Terry Pratchett. He's a famous author. I don't know how many of you have heard of him or come across him, but he writes kind of what was called Discworld novels. They're kind of fantasy novels with a certain humorous touch. But unfortunately, he's been diagnosed with a very early form of a strange form of early onset Alzheimer's disease. And he's still working despite that, but he will come across how that changes him. And there's this idea of disease and discontinuity. And one of the quotes I like from him is this one. It says, "Inside every old person is a young person wondering what happened." Now, cognition and aging is a very important thing, and it's not just about dementia. And I want to illustrate this with a picture. Now, this is a picture from in Britain, our favourite supermarket, so-called, certainly the one that makes the most money, Tesco's. Here are the people queuing up. I'm sure there must be supermarkets around Spain that look not too dissimilar to this. Recently, the chief executive of Tesco's complained about the quality of the staff he was employing coming out of school, and he said they couldn't really do the things they should be able to do. Their cognitive abilities weren't up to scratch. Now, that has important implications. You see, if you're in a supermarket and you've got, say, 10 tills and just one person isn't functioning very well, then you can go to the other 9 tills and you'll sweep through. A big queue won't build up. But if you're at 10 queues and everybody at those queues isn't down so much that they're hardly functioning at all, just like, say, someone would be with dementia at an old age, but they're just, say, 20% down, then that has a big impact on how many people you can put through your tills, and it has a big impact on Tesco's profits. And it has a big impact on us economically in old age, because it's just as important to look at the general population effect of everybody being a little bit worse as it is to look at the people who have specific disease, such as Alzheimer's disease, that causes them to be a lot worse. Because most people don't get Alzheimer's disease, but most people do get some degree of cognitive decline that can affect them as they age. So, there's another part of this, and that is, it's not so easy to define disease in old age. It's not so easy to disentangle aging from disease. And I'll pull out Alzheimer's disease because we've heard it mentioned today, and I think it's a very good example of how difficult it is. Now, Alzheimer's disease is named after a very famous neuropathologist. That's someone who looks at the brain and under the microscope, and he described originally the changes that you see in the brain. Alois Alzheimer, just over 100 years ago, described those changes, and they're very specific. They also, to have this disease though, you also have to have what's called the clinical syndrome of dementia. You don't just have to have the changes in the brain, but you actually have to have some decline in your cognitive abilities that leads you not to manage so well in your social or occupational function. That is what dementia is, how dementia is defined. It's cognitive decline, which it then impacts on how you function in society, or if you're still working, like Terry Pratchett, how you function in your work. And there are difficulties with this. The first one is defining pathology. Now, here is a story about some nuns. These nuns live in Kentucky in the United States. They live in an enclosed order. They went into their order when they were in their late teens, early 20s, and they haven't left. They don't smoke, they don't drink, they're very virtuous nuns. They have the same diet, they have the same environment, they don't go anywhere else. And they very kindly, one of the things they very kindly did, they've studied over many, many years, and one of the things they kindly did was agree to donate their brains when they died. Because, well, they're the kind of people who do that. So they were followed up, and year by year, researchers went in to decide who had Alzheimer's disease and who didn't, who had dementia and who didn't. And when they died, they said, aha, now we'll find out if we were right. So they looked at all the brains of the nuns, and they looked at the neuropathology, and of those that had neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease, only just over half actually had dementia. The others were walking around with a disease in their head, but no dementia. But if they had Alzheimer's disease neuropathology, and they had some little, what we call infarcts, that's little kind of clots blocking off the blood vessels, then they were much more likely to have dementia. There's something a problem with that, because Alzheimer, when he originally defined his dementia, defined it specifically not to be the kind of dementia that had clots, to have little infarcts, to have little kind of blockages of blood vessels. And even today, clinically, we say people have Alzheimer's disease if they don't have signs of disease of the blood vessels. So neuropathology is beginning to be found out to be not as good as it was thought to be about 100 years ago. And there's a large study in the UK, backed by the Medical Research Council there, UK Medical Research Council, and it found very much the same thing. Basically, some people gave their brains, they were well followed up, and a large proportion of them had the features of dementia, but far fewer of them actually had dementia in real life. They're walking around with the changes, but no disease. And you couldn't tell which ones were which. It wasn't as if they had the ones who were walking around with dementia had far more disease in their brain than the ones who didn't. There was no threshold. There were people walking around with lots and lots and lots of disease in their brain, but very little disease when it actually came to daily life. And people walking around with only a little bit of disease in the brain, but much worse off in daily life. Oh, I've got to come a bit closer. There is a problem defining dementia and in terms of occupational function. You may recognise the gentleman on the left. He's well known in Britain. His name's Prince Philip, and he's the Queen's consort. On the right is someone you probably don't know, nor do I. I was going to pretend he was from Peru, as we were in this wonderful pavilion, but I can't really. He's not from Peru. He's from China. But anyway, they're both older people, probably about the same age, and but dementia means something different for each one. You see, when Prince Philip gets up in the morning, he doesn't actually have to go out to work by putting his load on his back. He doesn't have to get himself kind of sort out where he's going to go. He has a secretary who tells him what he's going to do. He has someone to sort out his clothes for him. He has someone to cook his meals for him. He has a whole range of things being done for him. All he has to do is get there, put his clothes on, be taken out in his car, wave at a few people, say something intelligent, hopefully, not always, and then he returns home. The Chinese gentleman on the right has to do far more than that. And that has implications when you want to decide if someone's got dementia. This is a dementia threshold model. And there's various bits that I'm going to get you to look at. Let's see if the mouse will make me come up here. Ah, here we are. Look. Whoa, mustn't do that. That's naughty. Right. You will see there's these big yellow lines. Those big yellow lines are the decline in mental abilities over time, over age. And at some point, if your mental abilities decline enough, you go across this dotted line, which is a threshold for dementia. You reach a point whereby your cognitive abilities are so poor that you can no longer function occupationally. Now, if you've got poor social support, like the Chinese gentleman perhaps, and you're doing a big job, etc., then you'll go across that line much sooner than if you're Prince Philip, who's got lots of support, who can actually manage to decline quite a lot more before it actually affects what he has to do in his daily life. And there's something else that I want you to notice, is that people start at different points. Some people start higher than others. So if people start at what we call a higher pre-morbid IQ, their mental ability to start off with was higher, it will take them longer to go across that threshold to develop dementia. So the amount of disease you have would have to be quite a lot more before that person developed dementia clinically. What does it all mean? What does it all mean? It means that defining disease, such as we think we can define Alzheimer's disease and distinguish it from aging, but defining it actually is fraught with a whole range of problems which aren't very well sorted out and are rather flawed. And we need to have a good think about it as scientists. Now, for my next part of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about that bit where we saw one person starting off at a higher level than another. I'm going to talk about what's called pre-morbid intellectual ability, pre-morbid IQ. And I'm going to tell you, and quite a few slides are going to come up, so I'm going to tell you about this study which relates to a few of the slides that are coming, which is an important study, and it's a study from Scotland. It's a study I'm involved with. I'm one of the investigators on it. And Scotland is unique in as much as in 1921, all the children aboard in 1921 who grew up in Scotland and went to school and attended school on the 1st of June in 1932 all took a mental ability test. And it was a very good mental ability test. It was a group test. They all sat down in a room, just like we're doing today. Can you imagine sitting down in a room? There's all of you here in groups. Class sizes there are about 40 or so in Scotland. And they were 45 minutes. They were given a pen and paper with a piece of paper with an answer sheet, and they had to fill in the answers, 45 minutes altogether, of these 71 questions, which were then sent away and marked, and came up with a score. We still use that for many years later in the UK in something called an 11 plus, which was an exam set at the age of 11, which determined what kind of school you went to, whether you went to a grammar school or a secondary school or a technical school. They were all, it was a question of deciding who got the better academic education was determined on that IQ test. Anyway, all these children, and there were 85, the great thing about it was the whole nation, so there were 87,500 children, over 95% of all the children in Scotland at that time sat down on the 1st of June 1932 and they took this test. And Godfrey Thompson, being a pretty smart guy, also went to the trouble of checking that the test was very valid, and he correlated it with the Stanford Binet, which at the time still is perhaps, was the gold standard test, and it was fine. It correlated as well with the Stanford Binet as the Stanford Binet does with itself. So, 87,500 people. And this is what they took: Scottish Council for Research in Education, the 1932 mental tests suitable for pupils of 10 and 11 years of age. And it cost 4 pence, or 9 pence for a specimen set. That was that. That's I don't know what that is in euros. It must be about 5 cents, I think, if that. Well, we found all those results. This is fantastic. And we could follow up. Some of the people who were born in 1921 still survived. And I'm going to show you some of the results. The first set of results I'm going to show you are from Aberdeen. On the 1st of June 1998, which was, if you like, 66 years to the day from when they took that original test, about 100 or so people from Aberdeen who took that original test came and sat together in a hall and took it again. They took exactly the same test again. And so we could actually look at their scores and see how their IQ had changed over that whole lifespan, 66 years. And this is the graph. And what you can look at is have a look at how that graph goes beautifully together. It's kind of very grouped together. The people who scored high scores when they were 11 scored high scores when they were older, on the whole. And people who scored low scores when they were in 1998. Ooh, that's what that makes them 77. So when they were 77, they still scored, compared to 11, they were still scoring much the same. They stayed on track. And in fact, if you look at the amount of what we call variance, the amount you can explain the score, 77 from your score at 11, it can predict half of it. Predicts half the score at least. It's a phenomenal amount, actually. There are some exceptions. Let's see if we can get this thing to work. Yes, here we are. Look, here's someone who didn't score so well when they were young, but doing a bit better now. And here's someone who scored well when they were young, but doing much worse at 98. So there are individual differences. There are people falling off away from the line, but on the whole, people stay much the same. Now, that begs a question, doesn't it? That begs a question. What's going on? And is cognitive aging a good marker of aging? Is it a good marker of aging? And some people think that, in fact, everything ages together. You know, your teeth go, your hair goes, your skin gets wrinkly, you get a bit more short of breath when you run for the bus, you know, you can't go up so many flights of stairs, your eyesight's not so good. It's called the common cause hypothesis. And there's some issue as to whether that really exists, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But the trouble about looking at that is that it may be that you select, when people get older, a very, very healthy group, or a group with very similar characteristics, because maybe people with lower childhood IQs don't live on so well. Maybe they're less healthy, and therefore by the time they get older, you have a very selected group that tells you that people who are doing well with a higher IQ group who are still doing well later on, both physically and mentally. And one has to ask, are there particular mediators about that? Are there things that, if you've got a high IQ, predict why you do well physically? Could it be, we've heard about lifestyle, could lifestyle be an important mediator of how you do? Could it be the environment? Could it be that if you've got a higher IQ, you don't end up working in dirty factories or in areas where you're exposed to fumes, etc., and so you're more likely to survive? Well, there's a slight complication to this story, and here's a paper it just summarizes a paper using something called latent class analysis, which is a complicated thing, and it relates to a technique called structural equation modeling, which we'll come across a bit later. I'm not going to go into it now, but basically what it does is it tries to say, is it that everybody ages in the same way, or are there particular groups that age in different ways? And this is data from the United States. And they had two solutions, the 2-profile solution and the 4-profile solution. 4-profile solution fitted better than the 2-profile solution. So in the groups that they discerned, there was one group that was the general group. Most people were like this. They aged very similarly in lots of measures, socially, functionally, biologically. They all kind of aged in the same way. But there was another group who had, if you like, low marital satisfaction, so-called, and unfavourable personality characteristics. You can imagine the kind of people that would be. It would be people perhaps on the edge of the autistic spectrum, higher functioning people on autistic spectrum disorders. It might be people who've got unusual just kind of borderline personality disorders, those kind of things, who never really make relationships very well, and those people aged in a slightly different way because although they did okay biologically, their social functioning was all over the place. They aged in a completely different way. They aged much, much worse in that way. With the 4-profile solution, there was another group, 2 groups added. One was the maritally satisfied, so-called, but unhealthy group. These were people who had chronic disease. Perhaps they had something like cystic fibrosis or rheumatoid arthritis at a young age or something, and they aged in a different way. And finally, there was a group with low cognitive ability, a group who aged, again, in a rather different way, because they were at like the bottom in terms of their cognition. It had a big impact on them. Well, I want to talk about IQ and mortality to show that it links in. And here's 2 graphs. At the top, the women. And the red dots are the women who scored worst the first quarter on the IQ test, age 11. And the clear dots are those who scored best. And the more you go down, that means the more women are dying off. You can see that women with lower IQs died off much earlier than women with higher IQs. And in fact, a lot of that death occurred between the ages of 20 and 30. After that, the curves aren't quite so dissimilar. There's a lot of premature death related to women in their 20s and 30s. These are people born in 1921. So that would be in the years 1940 to 1950. The health service in the UK, National Health Service in the UK, came in 1948, really. So we have something interesting going on there. Something even more interesting that goes on with the men. Notice the same thing. The red ones are the men who started off with lower IQs, and at the end they're doing worse, aren't they? After the age of 50, they're dropping off much quicker. But something very funny happens to start off once they get to the age of 18 to about 24. They're dying off quicker than the ones with lower IQ. Why is that happening? Well, you have to go back to remember these folk were born in 1921. And so when they were around about 18, that was 1939. And this was just the time of the war. And the people with lower IQ didn't get selected into the forces because they weren't able enough. They weren't necessarily very good enough to hold guns and be trusted with things. They didn't get to. Whereas the ones who were very able got in to be fighter pilots and be officers first in line out of the trenches. They were much, much more likely to be in hazardous conditions, frontline troops. And so what we're seeing here is a rather strange paradoxical effect of IQ, where people with higher IQs in wartime were more likely to die off if you're a man. So the stories aren't always simple. You have to consider not just about aging in terms of what happens to people as they get to 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, but also what's going on at the time in the history, because different things will happen to what's called different cohorts. People born at different times will have different experiences, and that's a crucial aspect of understanding. So children born now may not experience the same kind of environmental exposures that have killed off some of these people early. You can't necessarily conclude that. Here's another structural equation model. I've put some pictures in. This is from the Midspan studies. Scotland has perhaps not the most envious reputation of having the kind of hotspot of early mortality in Western Europe. and it is in Glasgow. Glasgow has a poor reputation in terms of football at the moment, and it has an even worse reputation when it comes to people dying off. And amazingly, we have some people took part in a study in Glasgow in middle age, i.e. just when they were about to die off. This means in their 50s for people in Glasgow. We heard about people dying an average age of 40 at the beginning of about 1900. In Glasgow, that's not too far off what it really is even now. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but these studies were done in the 1970s and 1980s. Many men in Glasgow died before they reached the age of 60. So these are the mortality determinants in people in Glasgow and other bits of Scotland, but mainly around Glasgow. And it shows you that age 11, the score at age 11 for these people, had a direct impact on mortality. Had a direct impact. Where's an arrow? That means it's a direct impact. Being male had a big impact. Being in a deprived area of Glasgow had an impact, but not quite so big. And of course, part of that being a deprived area was because your social class was a bit lower and you had a lower IQ. So the whole thing fed through. It just shows you the impact of IQ, how it feeds through these different pathways to affect your mortality. It shows you how psychological health is associated with physical health. Often we think that physical health determines your mental health, but quite the opposite can be the case. I want you to think about that, because that's a crucial point. It doesn't have to be that your physical health determines your mental health. It can be quite the other way around and affecting you over the life course. It may be that what you need to do in terms of policies isn't necessarily to look at what's happening to older people, but to think about what you're doing for younger people at the time when they're having an education. Now, we all know that IQ might be a basket for a whole lot of lifestyle factors. Lifestyle clusters, the kind of people in Scotland who smoke are also the kind of people who drink. They're the kind of people who are more working class, etc., etc. And in the UK, we're a very class-ridden society, as I'm sure you're aware, perhaps a bit less now, but social class is an important proxy of these lifestyle clusters. It tells you a lot. And you probably also know, in terms of lifestyle factors, that caffeine is associated with a range of cognitive and health outcomes. A lot of people think drinking some coffee, a few coffees a day, helps boost your brain power. But there's actually coffee in tea. There's caffeine in tea. It doesn't have as much as coffee. It has about half the amount of a cup of tea. A nice cup of tea, as we say, has about half the amount of caffeine as a nice cup of coffee. And here's a lady, a typical lady enjoying her nice cup of tea. Gosh, look at her skin on her face. Can you see that? Can you see the wrinkles? Can you see the pigments? Fantastic. Velazquez would have loved that, wouldn't he? So, here we are. But there is something interesting about this. If you just look at caffeine intake, you will get a wrong effect. If you look at how much caffeine people take in, and you look at it in terms of their age 11 IQ, there's no association whatsoever. Absolutely no association. But once you start to split it by how they get their caffeine, it makes a big difference. So, for example, those people who drink it from filter or espresso or cappuccino coffee, and I'm sure that's exactly how it's drunk here in Spain, Seville, they're really bright when they're 11. People who are bright at 11, they choose to drink cappuccino or espresso coffees. They don't choose to drink it so much from instant coffee, like most of us do in Britain. They have the proper coffee. They also drink herbal and other teas as well. Whereas people who have got lower IQs, they choose to get their caffeine from tea. That's why there's a negative sign in front of that 0.113. They choose to get their caffeine from tea. So you've got a split. Everybody's getting caffeine, but some people are getting it from tea and some people are getting it from espresso coffee. If you just took caffeine altogether, you wouldn't work out what was going on. Now, what about in Spain? What about lifestyle in Spain? I don't know that they're all into kind of infusing coffee into you in Spain. That's going a bit far, isn't it? But same studies have been done here in Spain. And one of the these researchers were interested in was the what's called the SF36. Now, the SF36 is a measure of general health. Sometimes it's thought of as a quality of life measure. It ask people about a range of questions, asking them how they're functioning, how they're doing, how they're feeling about their mental health and about their physical health, adds up the scores and gives you one big number. That's the number, how good your life is. And in Spain, women's lives, when they're older, are worse than men. Don't know why that is, but I'm afraid women in Spain aren't doing so well as men in terms of their general life, quality of life or satisfaction. Maybe it's to do with education or lifestyle, we don't know. Maybe, as I said, it's to do with survivor effect. It may be that the men who weren't doing so well have died off, and yet women who aren't doing so well haven't died off, and so that kind of has an impact on when you go around asking women how they're doing. You've got a number of them who are doing very well but haven't quite died off yet. Now, giving a number, I don't know how you would feel if someone said to you, well, your quality of life is 7, or your quality of life is 14. You may not think that's really very adequate, and it isn't, is it? We looked at a different way of measuring quality of life where people select what they consider to be important in their lives. It uses a quality of life measure called the sequel. And what we did with this, again, same grade of people born in 1921, but we looked and asked them what they considered to be important for them. So at age 78, people mostly thought family was the main thing. But by age 82, it wasn't family. That wasn't their main concern. By age 82, things had changed, and it was their own health. Now, maybe some of their family had died off, or maybe their own health had got worse. Anyway, that was a shift. It's very important, and then you could actually look at measuring the quality of life on the domains that people say are important. You don't say, gosh, that person will just measure everything on family, because some people, they think their own health is important, and other people think it's socializing. You have to measure it on what people think is important for them. And what is true, though, and in contrast this with the Spanish results, men's quality of life was falling. They were doing worse, whereas women's was pretty stable. And if you look at the SF36, it did correlate with it, but mainly with the mental component of SF36 rather than physical. What was driving things was really people's mental well-being rather than their physical well-being. So, we're getting a bit closer to the end now, you'll be pleased to hear. There's just a couple more things I want to talk about. We talked about health and aging profiles, and the 4 profiles, the majority, the people with personality problems and difficulty maintaining close relationships, the people with lifelong chronic ill health. There's another important group in terms of health, aging, and that's the people with an intellectual disability. We heard the figures for 1900 and 2000 in terms of the general population. If I were to give you the figures for Down syndrome, the median age of Down syndrome, which is one of the major causes of intellectual disability, the median age of death in 1900 in the UK was 9. Okay? That was life expectancy. 9. You lived to 9. Now it's in the mid-50s. So it's an even bigger change than it is in the general population. So these are big groups that are coming up. Far more people are surviving with an intellectual disability now, things like Down syndrome, etc., than ever did before. And they have a different view of what their health is. Here's some data we published, and it's not kind of having a disease. That's not how they think of health. They have kind of 3 dimensions. One is diet, one is self-care, and one is activities. And I think we've heard some of these themes already coming through, but much more aligned, if you like, to a social model of health than a physiological one. So, I thought I'd better, as I was here, I'd better quote something from Cervantes. And he said, there are only 2 families in the world, my old grandmother used to say, the haves and the have-nots. And is that true? My son has just returned from Tanzania, and I think it's true in Tanzania. I think it probably... Thank you very much. That's great. So, I think that's true, but it's not really true in economically developed countries, because we have much more social mobility. And here's my last one of these fancy diagrams, showing you how IQ drives social mobility, how it drives social mobility. Notice what your father did, his social class, has an impact. It affects you. This is back in 1921, remember? So this is social mobility in the 20th century rather than the 21st. What your father did determined your education. If your father was more professional, you got a better education. If your father was more professional, you yourself were likely to go into a higher social class job. If your father was of a manual class, working class, you were likely to have less education. You were likely to go into a lower social class as your first job. But that's not the end of the story, because even though father's class is still affecting you, and F1 is a kind of measure of socio-economic position in old age, which relates to what your own main social class was. These are for people retired, where you live, and whether you drive a car. Even though it still relates to some degree, there's big drivers elsewhere. Obviously, your first class affects what you end up as. But again, not that much. Look at what really affects it is your IQ. Your IQ is driving a lot of these things throughout. It drives your education, it drives your first class a little bit, but it drives where you end up much more. If you've got a high IQ over your life course, that will, in the UK, or in Scotland, in the 20th century, that won out. There wasn't, if you like, a kind of what's called a meritocracy. People, I'm not sure it is meritorious to have a higher IQ, but if you say it is meritorious to have a higher IQ, define it that way, then people who had a higher IQ were able to do more in their work, they were able to achieve more and move up the social class, the socio-economic position in society. It wasn't all, the die wasn't cast at the age of 15 or whenever it was when you left school. It changed throughout your life and had an impact, therefore, on your health. So, last slide, you'll be pleased to hear. Health and aging, a few challenges ahead, and I think you'll hear about these more in detail over the next few weeks. As we heard, there is the majority group, probably most of us sitting in this room, who have been hitherto the focus for aging research. There's lots known about them. You'll hear lots more about them. You'll hear lots about the diseases they have. There is a group with chronic ill health. They are often a focus of specialist research. They're often people who have got rheumatoid arthritis and have disease-specific societies associated who have done lots of research to find out what happens to people with this particular disease as they age. There is a third group, which is the intellectual disability group, the people with Down syndrome and other causes of intellectual disability. Hitherto, they haven't been highly researched, but that's because not so many of them have lived to reach old age. I should say that for someone with Down syndrome, old age really starts, by 50 at least, if not by 45. More and more people are living to this age and will become a greater and greater number in society. And therefore, in the UK, we have about 1 million people. It's about 2% of the population, so about 1 million people have fallen into this group. So it's a lot. But more is being found out about them, and that's quite encouraging. There's one neglected group, and I'm not sure we'll hear much about it in this seminar, but I think it's something worthwhile thinking about, and that is people with personality and relationship problems. There's not much known about these people, but they may represent a significant proportion of population ill health, and they are people that probably need to have some sort of targeted thinking about and research on, because otherwise what we assume from the majority group or even the chronic ill health group is not necessarily applicable to how they age. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge a few people. The team at the Centre for Cognitive Aging and Cognitive Epidemiology, which I'm co-director, Aging UK and the Disconnected Mind, these are people who supported much of the research you've seen, the MRC Social Sciences and Public Health Unit in Glasgow, Health Foundation and Down Syndrome Scotland. Thank you very much.